So there's been an incredible, palpable mood change lately when it comes to the war in Ukraine. And that mood change seems to be taking place in all corners of the globe, even in some of the places that we would have least expected. And the reason for that mood change is obvious. At this current moment, Ukraine is absolutely humiliating the Russians every single day. And they're also impressing the entire world every single day by doing things on a repeated basis that are completely unprecedented in the history of all of human warfare. In fact, Ukraine is doing incredible things so often that there's literally not enough time to report on them before they do the next incredible thing. And I've experienced where I create videos that normally would have gotten everybody so excited those videos get less views than they normally would, just because Ukraine has already done something else that's incredible. The meta of this war has really changed lately, and it seems to be going in a very clear direction. But it's actually going to be worse for the Russians and better for the Ukrainians than it even seems and feels right now. And I can tell you that for a lot of different reasons. Just personally speaking, this mood change has been one of the most incredible things I've ever experienced. Because I've been following the war in Ukraine from the beginning, and I've been commenting on it for a long time. And I have watched the ebbs and the flows, the ups and the downs. And I have seen where Ukraine has been and where they've come from to where they are today. And seeing how they have come that far already, it is not a leap at all to think that Ukraine can go the next mile and go even further than anyone anticipated. And this is absolutely incredible. I remember when I first started this YouTube channel, which was actually probably at one of Ukraine's darkest moments. I started this channel around the time that Ukraine lost their major counteroffensive or canceled their major counteroffensive against the Russians because at that time they weren't ready for that kind of action. I started this YouTube channel around the time that Ukraine lost the fortress city of Avdiivka. And I started this YouTube channel around the time that the narrative that Ukraine was losing was by far the predominant narrative, especially in my own country. In fact, things were so bad that there were talks that weren't just talks, they ended up being true, about the United States removing aid from Ukraine because they deemed it to be a hopeless cause. I started the channel shortly before Donald Trump and President Zelensky had their famous spat in the Oval Office, where Zelensky was treated like to continue his war, or rather to continue fighting back against the Russians, was almost the same as to fight a war of aggression, because that is how hopeless everybody wanted the Ukrainians to feel. And I myself experienced some of this loss coming into this war around the time that I started this YouTube channel, as I lost a cousin on the front lines in Ukraine. He was an American, he volunteered, and unfortunately, he lost his life fighting for the Ukrainians and their freedom. I remember years ago when I was talking about things that I was treated like to say these things was wishful thinking at best. People wanted it to be true, but they just couldn't believe that it actually could ever be true. Because I've always believed that Ukraine could reach the point that they've now reached today, even in their darkest moments. But I remember the comments I used to get. I used to be told, for example, that simply sharing the facts and my opinions about why Ukraine was doing better than people thought was bad for Ukraine, because it was encouraging them, it was egging them on to continue a war that people had decided was ultimately hopeless. And I was told it was actually kind of evil to do that, and really there was a lot of negative press. But now the same people who once said that are changing their tone of voice. For example, just this week, a couple of days ago in the White House, President Zelensky was hosted again, and the tone of that meeting was completely different. He wasn't being talked down at publicly in a national media spectacle that looked very staged like the first time. He wasn't being humiliated to earn press points. He wasn't being humiliated so that the other side could act like they were the anti-war side and that somehow Ukraine was pro-war for defending itself. But instead, Zelensky had, as close as he could possibly get given the circumstances, a red carpet entry. The United States has recently switched its stance on Ukraine, although they haven't been super public about it. where they are no longer viewing Ukraine as the loser in this conflict. They are actually purchasing weapons from Ukraine, acknowledging that even they, the biggest, most successful economy on earth, is incapable of doing the things that Ukraine has done. And Ukraine, who used to be seen as this dependent country that was just a beggar, or at least that's how it was portrayed in my country, the United States, is now increasingly being recognized internationally. Rather than a dependent kind of parasite, they are now seen as the most dependable partner that you could possibly choose. A lot of things have completely changed. And when we look at the battlefield today, there is evidence of this and why people are changing their stance everywhere. At this current moment, as I sit here, Ukraine is sieging the entire peninsula of Crimea successfully, even more successfully than I ever thought they could, when I was indeed told that I was insane for ever thinking they could in the first place. Now the entire peninsula is essentially cut off, except for the bridge by which Ukraine is allowing Russians to leave the peninsula. Ukraine is also ramping up their strikes, of course, on Russian refineries, and increasingly on the Russian economy, on Russian wildberries facilities. But this is just the beginning. In fact, what we're seeing right now is nowhere near the end of the war. And the reason I've laid everything out this way is because I want you to see a really clear point by the end of this video, which is that if there was reason for hope in Ukraine all these years ago, when it seemed to most people that Ukraine was losing, how much hope is there now that Ukraine is actually accomplishing things every single day that nobody can deny because we can see them with our own eyes? If there was reason to be confident in Ukraine's cause when all we could see was a trajectory that was by no means bulletproof and by no means guaranteed, how much more reason is there to be confident in Ukraine's cause today, now that we see that they have come so far and are able to do so much? In fact, I've observed something lately that is absolutely uncanny, and it's this. People have gotten so used to Ukrainian innovation and the way that Ukraine is able to do things like they've never been done before, that they now sort of just check that box off and they take it for granted. And that causes people to not realize how much more advanced Ukraine is actually getting. Because Ukraine has actually re-innovated this war several times at this point. It started with drone warfare in general, and there's been several generations of innovation when it comes to drone warfare. And Ukraine, as I said, on a continual basis, does things that have never been done. And because it's so incredible, it often gets treated as if that was the end of the line, when in fact, it's not the end of the line. And right now, as you'll see in this video, Ukraine is bringing to the foray new advancements that are going to change not just this war, but the trajectory of human civilization, in some cases for better or for worse. Ukraine is bringing drone advancements to the table today that are so incredible that if I were to have told you about these a year ago, a large portion of my audience would have told me I'm completely insane. Maybe you're starting to see a theme here. For example, we're going to see advancements in the range of drones that are literally going to change the way that people think about and calculate not just warfare, but geopolitics in general. We're also going to see advancements in drones when it comes to AI technology at the shorter range and also at the longer range that are redefining the way that people, again, think about warfare. And we're also seeing advancements in ground robotics that are so incredible that the nature of the frontline war in Ukraine could start changing dramatically as soon as next year. In fact, it's already begun to change and has been completely rewritten in certain areas. A whole lot to talk about today, and you're going to be so impressed. Now, a big part of Ukraine's current advances are due to how well they've been adopting new technology, especially AI, which they've adopted better and faster than Russia, driving real-world results with less human intervention and human risk. That's an important reminder of the real edge that quick AI adoption can bring. But there are some barriers to that for the average person. And to help solve many of those, a great tool is Chat LLM by Abacus AI, the sponsor of today's video. Chat LLM solves a problem I've faced many times. which is how fragmented the AI landscape has become. There are just so many different models, all good at different things, and constantly changing. Some models are good at research, others are superior for image generation, and the list goes on, all accessed in different places from different browser tabs, often not talking to each other. And sometimes you don't even know they exist in the first place. With ChatLLM, it's different. ChatLLM is an all-in-one AI super assistant that gives you one dashboard to access all the best AI models, and it automatically routes your tasks to the best model for the job. That's powerful, not just because of time savings, but because it allows you to discover and leverage new models just as part of your workflow. And you'll always be caught up because ChatLLM adds new models within minutes of the model being launched. One dashboard and you get the latest version of GPT, Claude, Gemini, DeepSeek, and more, plus a variety of image and video generation tools like Flux, Nano Banana, Sora, and Kling. And then there's the price, which really got me. ChatLLM is just $10 a month, less than the price of a single premium AI subscription. It's not hard for that to pay for itself, and time savings alone. If you want to try it for yourself, just check out the link in the description. And thanks again to ChatLLM by Abacus AI for sponsoring today's video. So now let's dive into some specifics about Ukraine's growing technological capabilities that for a lot of people are going to completely rewrite the way they think about this war if it hasn't already been rewritten for them. And I want to start this conversation just at the high level by talking about how far Ukraine's drone production has come. Because a lot of people, they take for granted that Ukraine is good at drones. And they take it so for granted that they don't realize how incredible what Ukraine is actually doing is. I want to just rattle off some statistics for you here about Ukraine's drone production numbers for each year of the war. And I'm actually going to read them because the numbers are so all over the place that they're incredibly hard for me to remember, which shows you something in and of itself. So in 2022, which was the first year of the war, Ukraine produced between 3,000 and 5,000 total drones, and nearly all of these were imported systems, for example, from China. Ukraine was using just very basic drones at that point. By 2023, that figure increased from around 3,000 per year to around 300,000 units per year, which is a massive 100x increase. By 2024, that had increased dramatically again to approximately 2 to 2.2 million FPV drones. So 300,000 to 2.2 million. That's a big leap. And in and of itself, quite sufficient for most of Ukraine's needs, but they didn't stop there. In 2025, Ukraine produced more than 4 million drones. And in that year, there was a site that was statted, which was a 900% surge in drone production from the year prior. Incredible growth. But again, Ukraine didn't stop there. And now we're in 2026. And Ukraine for this year initially targeted that they would build 7 million drones. But they're already on target, we're halfway through the year, to produce 10 million drones instead. So they are still more than doubling their production every single year, even though they've already reached the point where the base number is incredibly high. And for next year, they're projected to do that again, with Zelensky saying that Ukraine is expected next year in 2027 to produce 20 million drones. This is a massive number. And a lot of people, again, you take it for granted, but you don't realize how far Ukraine has actually come. There's a recent interview with Magyar, the head of Ukraine's drone forces, where he's talking about the early days of Ukraine's drone warfare. And in the early days, they started out using drones that were built for other purposes, with cameras to scout out Russian artillery positions. And then they would communicate the coordinates of those positions via Discord, which was a gaming app, basically, or an app that most people who use it are gamers who are just trying to talk about their game. Ukraine used this app to communicate artillery coordinates, and then Ukraine would strike those targets in conventional means. Then Ukraine developed the ability to drop, for example, single explosives from drones to eliminate Russian targets directly. And from there, those early days of 3 to 5,000, Ukraine next year is going to be producing 20 million drones a year. And I want to stress this is far more than they need. And Ukraine has been producing more than they need for a long time. And that's why Ukraine can afford to export drones to countries like the United States, but also to other countries. Ukraine has come from depending on other people for support to literally having a surplus of military equipment, at least in this category. That is absolutely incredible, a complete change in the way we think about the war. But it does not stop there, not by any means. At a high level, when we see production numbers like this that are high and increasing, it shows us that what Ukraine is doing today that's absolutely humiliating for the Russians, striking targets all across Russia, Moscow, St. Petersburg, deep within Russia, Crimea, it doesn't matter. This isn't Ukraine pushing up against its limits. It's not like Ukraine saved up everything for this big moment to create a big propaganda campaign to get people's attention. Instead, Ukraine is just using the capacity that it's built for itself, a capacity that's not shrinking, it's actually growing. And actually, when you compare that to the Russians, just by the way, it's the complete opposite situation for the Russians in most categories, where most of the things that the Russians were counting on, they've run out of. Putting that aside, though, the numbers alone don't tell us the full picture. We also need to look at the capabilities. And a truly impressive capability that Ukraine has been demonstrating lately is how they're able to get drones not just to fight along the front lines, but to strike deep within Russia. In fact, when it comes to this topic, there was a statement that was made recently by President Zelensky of Ukraine that I personally found to be absolutely chilling, especially as I considered the long-term implications, which were definitely understated in the statement itself. President Zelensky was talking about the capability in terms of range of Ukraine's drones. And he said that currently they can go about 3,000 kilometers, but by the end of the year that's expected to reach 4,000 kilometers deep within Russia. But that by the end of next year, 2027, that could be increased as high as 10,000 kilometers. And you have to realize something, guys. Zelensky doesn't typically overstate things like this. He is usually providing accurate data that he's getting from industry, and it almost always turns out to be true. In fact, if anything, it usually turns out to be better in terms of the speed of advancements than Zelensky implies with his own public-facing statements. And in the few cases where perhaps he is wrong, he's not wrong about capability, he's wrong maybe about timeline, and it comes pretty quickly after it was expected, which honestly, that is better, guys, than most major companies can ever claim for anything. And we're talking about an entire country here. The point is, he has quite the track record. And if true, this 10,000 kilometer number is world changing. Now, for you Americans, 10,000 kilometers is something a little bit above 6,000 miles, a truly massive range. And this is something that Ukraine will achieve with a drone, which it might be, not as cheap as the drones they're using now, if it can go that far, but it will definitely be far more affordable than any options we currently have on the planet to regularly conduct strikes at that range. And it literally has the capability to change the way the entire world thinks about warfare and geopolitics. It's not an exaggeration. There's a corollary here. When we think of the B-2 stealth bomber, for example, which coincidentally has an unfueled range of around 11,000 kilometers, I think a little bit above 6,700 miles, that changed the world. Now, the B-2 stealth bomber can also refuel in midair, and that extends its range. But the point is, the United States having this kind of strike range changed the way the world thought about warfare. And really, it became about how the United States could project air power. Now, we're currently seeing some of the limits of that with the old systems, with the war in Iran, but that's besides the point. I'm talking about how it changed really the last generation of warfare and the last generation of geopolitics. Now, if Ukraine is able to match the unfueled range of the B-2 bomber, that changes the calculus, because a capability that remains firmly pretty much only in the hands of the United States, China claims to have it, but there's some reasons to be skeptical, that's going to become available for a lot more countries, which means the capability for deterrence against major world powers can now rest in the hands of even small countries. But on the flip side, the capability for terror will also be increased if the wrong people get their hands on this technology. Drone, it might not be as capable as a B-2 stealth bomber. I'm not claiming that. But the drone has an advantage that's becoming increasingly obviously relevant for the future of warfare, which is that you can produce a lot of them really cheaply. And so you can't just throw a couple at a target. You can just keep throwing them at the target over and over and over and over again. And also the infrastructure to support these launches is, it could be much more distributed. So even if you can't refuel in midair like a B-2 can and fly all the way across the globe and hit any planet from your home base, any target on the planet from your home base in Missouri, you can still overcome those relative advantages just in different ways. And really what we're seeing right now in warfare is how cheaper, more affordable systems that can be made in bulk can overcome more advanced systems over time. And Ukraine is absolutely dominating in this space. It will mean that they will likely soon be able to strike targets all the way on the Pacific side of Russia, the port of Vladivostok, which is just horrifying for the Russians because these are the areas that they've long thought were safe. And some of the things that Russia really doesn't want the Ukrainians, for example, to ever be able to hit, they're starting to try to build them deeper in Russia out of range, but they just cannot get far enough away. This is absolutely incredible. And by the way, that was the number for the end of 2027. I don't know what the actual engineering limits here are, but my guess is that that number will be even greater in 2028 with slightly diminishing returns, and the range will continue to grow and grow. Maybe it could even reach the range, theoretically, of a stealth bomber that does refuel in midair. It's absolutely incredible what Ukraine is doing, and it means the pain that they're doing to the Russians right now, with all their strikes across Russia that we see headlines of every single day, entire facilities burning down, the country, the economy seems to be burning down. Ukraine, again, they're not at their limit. They're just getting started. Now, all of this is incredible, but as we're realizing increasingly all over the world, air power alone does not win wars. The United States is realizing that with Iran, where Iran is continuing to engage in warfare with them, despite the fact that the United States clearly has superior air power. But Iran is trying to overcome that with swarms of drones, and it's not the topic of this video. The point is, air power alone doesn't win wars, and we're also seeing that in the war in Ukraine, with the Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities every night with drones and missiles. And so Ukraine does need other technology, probably, to ultimately win this war, at least if the war is won, on the battlefield rather than through political change or something crazy happening within Russian society itself. But Ukraine can't count on that, and so they have to develop the other solutions as well. The good news is Ukraine is developing those solutions, and the trajectory looks very similar to the trajectory they were on with their drones earlier in this war, which means it has every capability to increase within a couple of years just as quickly as the drones have, maybe not to the same precise numbers, but certainly to a more than sufficient scale. So with Ukraine's ground robots, let me just talk in terms of capability first here, because Ukraine has just done a couple of record-breaking things, world-first things, just in the past month or so. It comes down to the deployment options for ground robots, which are being deployed by other kinds of drones. We saw, for example, in a place called the Kinburn Spit, an incredibly strategic piece of territory guarding the mouth of one of Ukraine's biggest rivers, Ukraine conducted an amphibious landing where the landing craft was a drone and the landing was done by a ground robot that came from that naval drone. Absolutely incredible. No humans involved for the type of mission that historically has been seen as the single most dangerous type of mission that you could possibly do. Very incredible. And just think about Crimea and where Ukraine could go with that technology at sufficient scale in terms of getting their territory back in the long term. Again, I've said it for a lot of years now. People told me I was crazy. Here it is. I just love saying that, guys. I think a lot of you in the audience feel the same way, and that's why I keep doing it. But there's also been a recent deployment of a ground robot from an air-based drone, which is also incredible. So Ukraine is able to deploy these ground robots in ways that human infantry has been deployed in the past for fast insertions or insertions that are meant to overcome certain positions. This is incredible. It gives Ukraine a lot of options for navigating these robots to conduct missions that the Russians simply wouldn't expect coming. So the technological advancement is there. And now we have to consider, even though the technology is there, does Ukraine have it at sufficient scale to actually do things? And it's not as rosy as the drone picture, but recall that this technology is much newer and it's taken a lot longer to master. But the production numbers are going up. So just like before, because the numbers change so much, it's hard to remember, I'm actually going to read these numbers right here on my iPad. And so I just want to talk in terms of successful missions to show you how rapidly things are increasing. So in November of 2025, Ukraine was conducting approximately 2,000 missions a month with ground robots. By January of this year, 2026, that had increased from 2,000 to approximately 7,500 missions every month. That's a big increase. By April, that had increased to 11,000 missions every month. And by June, which is the last complete month we have data for, that was 16,676 missions for the month of June. And I can tell you for July, we're expecting that final number to also increase pretty dramatically, but we'll update on that soon. The point is, Ukraine is on a trajectory to implement these ground robots more regularly, very similarly to how they earlier implemented drones. And these robots are currently doing several different missions. Most predominantly, they're replacing the human element in the supply chain in insertions and extractions, because those are typically the most dangerous moments for a soldier when they're entering or leaving a position, so they can get supplies by using a robot instead of a human. It saves a lot of human lives. If you think about 16,000 robots, and each one of them can conduct multiple of these missions, even if they're hit, a lot of times they survive the hits, which obviously, unfortunately, the humans don't. Absolutely incredible. But the robots have also had proofs of concept where they are holding entire positions, pieces of territory, for months at a time. Now, I want to talk about the production numbers because it's a similar trajectory. Again, I'll reference on my iPad here. And so in 2024, Ukraine was producing just 2,000 units of ground robots. Again, the same they were using in the month of November 2025. By 2025, Ukraine had produced about 15,000 to 16,000 units a year of ground robots. And in 2026, they have 25,000 plus units that are contracted. But again, when we look at the drones and the robots, Ukraine actually has a track record of typically beating the contracted numbers. Now, it's a trajectory that is similar, although on a different scale than the trajectory that drones were on earlier in the war. And when we consider that people have come from using, like photography drones to identify artillery positions and sending coordinates over Discord and dropping a grenade, to striking Moscow like every single night with drones in just 4 years, we realize that Ukraine definitely can get there. And they can definitely, at least theoretically, get up to the point, like with drones, where within a couple of years, they could be producing millions of units every year. It might sound impossible, but think about how many vehicles, in general, are produced every single year. Think about how many tracked vehicles, in terms of tractors or construction equipment. All those things are produced every single year across the globe. This is not an outlandish target. It can be achieved. And so when the numbers are there, the technology is already there, Ukraine can overwhelm the Russians, and they do not have a corollary to this to respond to the Ukrainians. Now, having gone through these categories and these numbers now, the last thing to mention, which is an across the board, is how Ukraine is implementing AI, and they're using it across every category that I've mentioned here today. And this is really important as part of this discussion, because it's a multiplying force on everything that I've already said. Because AI is allowing fewer Ukrainian drone operators to operate a larger amount of drones, which means not only is Ukraine producing more drones or ground robots, they're also being able to use more of those simultaneously than they ever have before, which is a deadly win-win. For example, one of the reasons Ukraine has sieged Crimea so effectively is because they're using loitering drones over Russian highways. And so these drones don't have to have a human operator watching them the whole time. They can kind of just sit around and wait until a target comes into vision. And when they have a target that looks like a target that comes into vision, the Ukrainian operator can then dial into that specific drone and they can decide whether or not they want to complete the mission. A force multiplier. AI is being used increasingly with target identification, and it's making Ukraine more effective across the board. There's recently, for example, some new satellite technology that Ukrainians are increasingly using, directly getting feeds to their phones or their iPads or whatever, that, for example, takes pictures of the battlefield landscape. And if it detects even a tiny change in a Ukrainian unit sector, that change gets sent to them. So if it looks like the ground was driven over by a vehicle, that the Russians are now hiding in a structure, the satellites tell Ukraine exactly where the Russians are, or at least are likely to be, and then they can go and they can be more efficient on the missions that they do go on because they're not searching for targets. They already know where the targets are. That is a massive force multiplier too. And when you go from earlier in the war, where you had soldiers who did not have enough drones, who had to manually identify the targets and then manually carry out the strikes, to the picture that we have today, where Ukraine has more than sufficient numbers of drones. One operator can fly multiple of the drones that go into areas where the Russians are already known or at least expected to be. And they can then dial into those drones only precisely at the moment where they're actually needed to do the human element. It's just crazy to think about the scale of what Ukraine is actually capable of, or at least will very soon be capable of. And again, we can apply all the same logic to Ukraine's long-range strikes and things of that sort. And so the Russians are really, really in trouble. You know, they haven't won the war fast enough, and now Ukraine has finally reached the point where, again, the trajectory I've been talking about for years is no longer the trajectory, it's here today. But the trajectory is also not over. The trajectory is still continuing. And the problem for the Russians is that the trajectory is moving in the opposite direction. The Russians still have some capabilities. I don't want to frame them as completely defenseless. But for the most part, the tactics that they've relied on are obsolete. They're not getting any results. And they're running out of the things they need to carry out those tactics. Because they relied on them, they didn't advance as fast as the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians now have the edge, and it's not likely at all that the Russians can close that gap. That's a topic for another video, though. But at this point, the Russians are running lower than they ever have on soldiers. They're running out of fuel. Their economy is in the dumps more than it's ever been. That trajectory, again, just like the trajectory before, is still continuing. And just like the trajectory of Ukraine's success, the trajectory of Russia's decline has also reached a point where it's no longer just a trajectory, we're actually seeing it in real time. And just like the trajectory of Ukraine's success, the trajectory's not over. It's just finally reached a point where even the biggest doubters will say, you know, there actually was something to that the entire time. With that being said, though, those are all topics to explore more fully in depth in other videos, as I already have.